Bears are typically shy and avoid humans, but their behavior shifts when food or proximity forces interaction. Such was the case for a hiker whose serene trek turned into an unforgettable encounter with a bear. What happened next? Join us as we unravel this extraordinary nature caution and survival story. Tom Hensley had always prided himself on his ability to navigate the wild. At 42, with decades of hiking experience, he had faced blistering heat, torrential rain, and the raw cold of desolate mountains. The Alaskan wilderness was his latest challenge, a vast expanse of untamed beauty, where rivers carved through jagged valleys and snow-dusted peaks loomed like ancient sentinels. It was where man was insignificant, and that insignificance drew him in. He prepared meticulously, layers of thermal gear, a sharp knife, a high-powered bear spray, and a GPS device. He didn't account for a predator that played by its own rules. On October 25, 2024, Tom left his cabin near the Denali foothills and began his trek. For 3 days, he followed a route that wound through spruce forests and open tundra, relishing the isolation. The absence of cell service wasn't a problem. He carried a satellite beacon for emergencies. He camped each night under a canopy of stars, the silence broken only by the whispers of wind and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. His mind was at peace, and his movements were efficient. The wilderness was brutal, but it was predictable, or so he thought. It began on the morning of October 28th. Tom was traversing a narrow ridge when he noticed deep furrows in the dirt, claw marks unmistakably fresh. He paused, scanning his surroundings. The stillness was disconcerting. No bird calls, no rustling leaves. A faint unease prickled his neck. He knew the signs of an apex predator's territory, but it wasn't until he descended into the valley that he saw the massive prints. They were bigger than any he had encountered, the impressions sharp and deliberate, as if the animal had walked with purpose. Tom adjusted his pack and kept moving, his senses on high alert. The first encounter came late that afternoon. Tom had just crossed a shallow stream when he spotted the bear. It was colossal, its hump towering over its massive shoulders, its fur a rich, mottled brown. The grizzly stood 50 yards away, staring at him with unsettling stillness. Tom froze. Every instinct screamed for him to slowly back away, avoiding eye contact. He followed the protocol, moving with deliberate caution, his hand hovering over the bear spray. But the bear didn't charge. It didn't retreat either. Instead, it began to circle him, its movements almost leisurely. It would disappear behind a thicket, only to reappear on the other side, closer now. At one point, it brushed past a tree just 10 feet away from him, its eyes locking with his for a chilling moment. Tom's heart thundered in his chest. This wasn't normal behavior. Grizzlies could be territorial, aggressive, or dismissive of humans, but this bear's actions felt calculated. It was sizing him up. Tom spent the next hour attempting to distance himself. He crossed streams, climbed ridges, and plunged into dense undergrowth while glancing over his shoulder. The bear followed. It didn't hurry, didn't hide. It simply shadowed him as if ensuring he couldn't forget its presence. By dusk, Tom found a rocky outcrop and decided to make camp. He hoped the elevation would deter the bear. Exhausted, he fortified his position as best he could, setting his bear spray within arm's reach and gripping his knife as darkness swallowed the land. Sleep was impossible. He heard the bear's heavy footfalls below at intervals, twigs snapping and leaves rustling. He could imagine its silhouette creeping out of sight, waiting for something he couldn't comprehend. Around midnight, new sounds joined the bear's movements, lighter, more erratic steps. He peered into the gloom and caught fleeting shapes in the moonlight. 2 smaller grizzlies had joined the first. Tom's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was something orchestrated. The next day, Tom pressed on, fighting the mounting fear that had taken root in his chest. The bears continued their haunting pursuit, their presence oppressive. Kodiak, as Tom later learned locals called the massive male, seemed to relish the torment. It would vanish for hours, only to return suddenly, closer than before. The smaller bears mimicked its behavior, darting into view and disappearing, their movements disjointed but purposeful. By mid-afternoon, Tom's nerves began to fray. He tried to calm himself, relying on logic and experience, but the situation defied explanation. Why hadn't they attacked? Was Kodiak toying with him, or was this some darker ritual of dominance? When the attack came, it was with terrifying precision. Tom had reached another ridge, thinking the bears had finally abandoned him. He was wrong. Kodiak emerged from the shadows first, its massive frame blocking his path. Behind it, the smaller bears flanked him, cutting off any retreat. The world seemed to hold its breath for a brief, agonizing moment. Then Kodiak surged forward. The Grizzly's speed was a horrifying blur. Tom raised his bear spray, releasing a cloud of capsaicin that temporarily halted the charge, but Kodiak barely flinched. It swatted the canister aside with a massive paw. Tom screamed internally as the bear slammed into him, its sheer weight knocking him to the ground. His knife found purchase in Kodiak's flank, but it was a futile effort against the predator's fury. The smaller bears joined the fray, their claws raking his sides as he struggled to fight back. The attack was brutal and unrelenting. Tom's world dissolved into pain, blood, and the roars of his assailants. Kodiak's strikes were methodical, claws ripping through flesh with terrifying efficiency, yet it didn't deliver a killing blow. It seemed to relish his suffering, stepping back occasionally to observe the damage before lunging again. The smaller bears mirrored this behavior, their attacks punctuated by moments of eerie stillness. When the bears finally left, Tom was barely alive. They disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind a man broken in body and spirit. Blood soaked the ground around him, and every breath was a struggle. He lay motionless for hours, gazing at the sky as the crushing weight of his fate bore down on him. His battered body left him immobilized, unable to call for help, and he remained that way until he drew his final agonizing breath. When a group of hikers eventually discovered him, his body was cold and stiff. They alerted the park rangers, who recovered his remains and identified him through the belongings in his bag. His family was notified, and he was later laid to rest in a quiet cemetery. The tragedy sent shockwaves through his community, leaving his loved ones and many others in deep mourning. Yet no amount of grief could undo what had been done or bring him back to life. Greg slipped silently through the underbrush of the Montana wilderness, his boots leaving faint impressions on the damp earth. The forest whispered around him, its sounds a mix of wind-rustled leaves and the distant call of birds. After years of teaching survival techniques, he had longed for this trip, a return to solitude and the primal simplicity of nature. This was his element, where he felt more alive than in the confines of civilization. The morning had passed uneventfully. Greg tracked the path of a creek, scanning the surroundings for signs of wildlife or landmarks. His movements were automatic, honed by years of experience. He carried little: a sturdy knife, bear spray, and a small pack of essentials. It wasn't supposed to be a challenge, but a celebration of his lifelong connection to the wild. Around midday, Greg came across a fresh elk carcass that tightened his chest. Blood pooled around the massive animal's neck, staining the forest floor. Its ribs had been gnawed open, exposing glistening organs. The scene was a raw testament to the food chain in action, but it wasn't the kill that froze Greg. It was what it meant. Bears often guarded their kills, and this one was fresh. Greg's eyes swept the trees and brush. He saw no sign of movement, but the weight of his realization hung heavy. The forest suddenly felt too quiet. His breathing slowed as he turned, step by deliberate step, retracing his way back along the trail. Then the crack of a branch echoed behind him. He turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the unmistakable silhouette of a grizzly bear. It wasn't just any grizzly. It was a mother, and two cubs lingered in the distance. Her massive frame rippled with power as she locked eyes with him. She snorted, her ears back, and her body language clarified her intention. He was a threat. The charge came before Greg had fully processed the situation. Years of training took over. He dropped his pack and sprinted to the nearest tree, a sturdy pine with low branches. His muscles burned as he scrambled up, pulling himself higher than he'd thought possible in such a short time. From his perch, he could see her below, pacing and growling, the cubs retreating to the safety of the woods. But the bear wasn't giving up. She reared onto her hind legs and batted at the tree trunk with her claws, shaking it violently. Greg gripped the branch, his heart hammering, the rough bark scraping his palms. The bear roared, each guttural sound reverberating in his chest. When the tree swayed with her attacks, a sickening realization hit him. This perch wasn't as safe as he had hoped. Another fierce shake broke his grip, and Greg fell. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and he barely rolled aside as the bear lunged. Instinct screamed at him to reach for the bear spray, but it had fallen in the scramble. His hand closed instead around his knife, and as the bear charged again, he slashed upward. The blade connected, leaving a shallow cut across her shoulder. She roared, but the injury seemed only to enrage her. She came again, her teeth snapping inches from his face. Greg moved rapidly, rolling and slashing, aiming for her vulnerable underbelly. Pain flared through his leg as her claws raked him, tearing through muscle and fabric. Adrenaline dulled the agony, but Greg knew the damage was severe. He had to think. Panic would kill him faster than the bear. He lashed out again, targeting her snout, a sensitive area. The knife struck true, and she recoiled briefly, giving him the space to crawl toward the fallen bear spray. His fingers closed around the canister, and he unleashed it in a fiery burst directly at her face. The bear released a startled bellow, retreating momentarily as the chemical sting overwhelmed her senses. Greg used the chance to drag himself toward a cluster of dense shrubs, his leg throbbing with every inch gained. The mother grizzly lingered, pawing at her face and shaking her head, but she didn't leave entirely. She stalked the area for long minutes, her growls a reminder of her dominance. Greg pressed himself into the shadows of the undergrowth, every nerve on edge. Blood seeped from his wounds, soaking into the soil beneath him. Eventually, the bear gathered her cubs and lumbered off, though Greg knew better than to relax. He had survived the immediate attack, but the fight was far from over. The gashes on his leg were deep, and he could feel the warm stickiness of blood loss. Infection was another looming threat. He was miles from help, and the nearest sign of civilization was a 3-day trek through the forest. He tore strips from his shirt to bind the wound, applying pressure to stem the bleeding. Every movement was excruciating, but he forced himself to focus. His training demanded action. He couldn't afford to collapse here. Greg fashioned a makeshift crutch from a sturdy branch and began the slow, agonizing process of moving. Hours blurred together as he hobbled through the wilderness. Each step was a battle against pain and exhaustion. His vision swam, and the forest around him seemed to shift and darken. He rationed his water carefully, but his body cried out for rest and sustenance. As the first night fell, Greg found a shallow depression in which to shelter. He gathered what little he could for warmth, his body trembling uncontrollably. The stars above were indifferent to his plight, their cold light a stark reminder of nature's impartiality. By the second day, the fever set in. His leg throbbed with searing heat, and the edges of the wound inflamed despite his crude attempts at cleaning it. Delirium crept in, his mind conjuring images of safety that vanished as quickly as they came. He kept moving, driven by sheer willpower and the fading hope of survival. When a rescue helicopter finally spotted him, Greg was barely conscious. The search team, alerted by his failure to check in days earlier, had found him slumped against a tree, his body weak but alive. The hospital stay was long and grueling. The infection had taken root and several surgeries were required to repair the damage. His leg never fully recovered, leaving him with a permanent limp. Yet, as Greg lay in the sterile confines of the hospital, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The wilderness had shown him its harshest truths, stripping away the illusions of control and dominance he'd once held. Survival wasn't about mastery over nature, but respect for its power and unpredictability. Though he had won this battle, Greg knew it wasn't a triumph. It reminded him of his fragility, a lesson etched into his body and soul. As he stared out the hospital window, he felt humbled and grateful to have emerged from the forest alive. Diane adjusted the strap of her camera bag, the weight familiar and reassuring. She was deep in the Yukon wilderness, surrounded by towering pines and a misty, overcast sky. This was her sanctuary, where her passion for wildlife photography flourished. She had spent weeks here, capturing images of caribou herds, soaring eagles, and the ethereal glow of the aurora borealis. But she craved something more, a grizzly, raw and powerful, caught mid-motion in its natural habitat. Rumors of an unusually aggressive bear had circulated among the locals and guides she'd spoken to. There had been warnings, stories of shredded tents, livestock killed near settlements, and even an attack on an unprepared hiker. Diane dismissed these accounts as exaggerated tales designed to spook outsiders. She wasn't an outsider. Years of experience. They taught her how to read animal behavior and move silently through their world. She convinced herself that she was different, careful, and capable. The morning was cool and damp as she ventured deeper into the forest, far from the familiar trails. The forest floor was soft underfoot, moss cushioning her every step. She moved with precision, her senses attuned to the faintest sounds, the twig snap and the rustle of underbrush. Her camera was always ready, her fingers twitching for the shutter. Hours passed before she found what she was looking for. There it was, a grizzly, its massive frame half hidden by branches. It was larger than she expected, its fur a mottled brown streaked with gray. It stood over the remains of a moose carcass, its snout and paws streaked with blood. The scene was visceral, primal, and perfect. Diane's heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She knew the risks of closing in, but the shot was irresistible. She crouched low, moving carefully, adjusting her lens to frame the bear against the backdrop of the forest. The grizzly didn't notice her at first, engrossed in tearing flesh from the moose's ribcage. She clicked the shutter, the sound muffled by the dense air. Shot after shot. Each frame felt like a triumph. But then the bear stopped. Its head rose abruptly, ears swiveling. Diane froze, her breath catching. The grizzly's dark eyes locked onto hers. They stared at each other momentarily, and she felt the weight of its gaze, a predator sizing up a threat. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't move. She had encountered bears before and knew to stay calm and avoid sudden movements. The bear took a step forward, then another, leaving the carcass behind. Diane slowly stood, her instincts telling her to retreat, but as she backed away, the bear followed, its movements deliberate. It wasn't bluffing or posturing. This wasn't a warning charge or a territorial display. It was interested in her, its focus unnervingly intense. Diane's confidence began to crumble as the bear continued its approach. She turned and started walking faster, her camera swinging against her hip. She glanced back. It was still following, its pace unhurried but purposeful. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind. She had bear spray in her bag, but it was buried beneath her gear, and she knew she wouldn't have time to retrieve it if the bear decided to charge. She quickened her pace, weaving through the trees, hoping to lose it. But the grizzly stayed with her, its massive form slipping through the forest with an unsettling ease. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the bear stalked her. Whenever she thought she had gained distance, she would spot it again, a dark shape moving between the trees, its presence a constant looming threat. The chase became a test of endurance. Diane's legs burned as she scrambled over fallen logs and pushed through thickets of brush. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, and her heart thundered in her chest. She tried to think, to form a plan, but the primal fear of being hunted clouded her thoughts. As dusk fell, the forest grew darker, its shadows deepening. Diane found herself near a rocky outcrop. She climbed, hoping to put a barrier between herself and the bear. The uneven terrain scraped her hands and knees, but she pressed on, adrenaline driving her. She reached a narrow ledge, her chest heaving as she looked below. The bear was there, circling the base of the rocks. It seemed almost methodical, testing the boundaries of her refuge. Night enveloped the forest, and with it came the bitter cold. Diane shivered, her clothes damp with sweat and the evening mist. She clutched her camera like a talisman, its weight meaningless now. The bear remained below, pacing occasionally but never leaving. Its persistence was terrifying, as if it were savoring the hunt. Exhaustion began to take its toll. Diane's limbs felt heavy, her movements sluggish. When she tried to reposition herself on the ledge, her foot slipped, dislodging a small cascade of stones. The noise startled the bear, and it reared onto its hind legs, letting out a deep, resonant growl that echoed through the forest. Then it climbed. Diane scrambled backward, her hands grasping for anything to hold on to. The bear's claws scraped against the rock, its strength undeniable. She fumbled for her bag, her numb fingers searching for the canister of bear spray. She found it, her hope rekindled, but the bear lunged as she tried to free it. Its weight crashed into her, knocking her from the ledge. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her vision. Pain flared in her ribs, but there was no time to register it fully. The bear was on her, its jaws snapping inches from her face. She tried to fight, swinging the canister unthinkingly, but the bear swatted it away. Its claws tore into her, each strike a searing agony. She kicked and thrashed, but it was futile. The grizzly was relentless, its power overwhelming. Diane's screams echoed through the forest, but there was no one to hear them. The attack ended as abruptly as it began. The bear stepped back, its snout dripping with blood. It stood over her for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her broken and bleeding on the forest floor. Diane lay there, her body shattered, her breaths shallow and labored. The sky above was a canvas of stars, their cold light indifferent to her suffering. She thought of her passion, the endless hours spent chasing the perfect shot, and how it had led her here. By morning, a search team found her. She was barely alive, her body a patchwork of injuries that would take months to heal. Her camera was still clutched in her hand, and the lens cracked but was intact. The images she had risked everything for were recovered, each a testament to her talent and recklessness. Diane survived, but she was forever changed. The wilderness had shown her its raw, unforgiving power, stripping away her illusions of control. The perfect shot had cost her more than she could have imagined, a clear reminder of the line between passion and folly. A sprawling national forest in western Wyoming lay vast and silent, its rugged expanse bathed in the ethereal glow of a star-drenched sky. The Maddox family, Mark, his wife Emily, and their two children, 11-year-old Claire and 7-year-old Ethan, had settled into their campsite by a small, picturesque clearing. They had done everything by the book. The food was secured in a bear canister 50 yards from their tent. The fire was extinguished, and all scents were scrubbed from their bodies before bedtime. It was supposed to be a peaceful family escape into the wilderness, a chance to reconnect under the glow of constellations and the hushed whispers of the pines. But this wilderness had been changing. Over the past few months, reports of an adolescent grizzly frequenting campsites had circulated among park officials. Unafraid of humans, the young bear had learned to associate their presence with easy meals. A forgotten granola bar here, a carelessly left more fantastic there. It didn't take much for instincts to twist into dangerous habits. Officials had tried to track it, but the bear was elusive, slipping through the vast forest like a shadow. Unbeknownst to the Maddox family, this same bear had caught the faint scent of their camp earlier that evening. It was young, hungry, and encouraged by the memory of scavenged food. By the time the family was nestled in their sleeping bags, lulled by the gentle crackle of the forest, the bear had begun circling their campsite. The first sound was a faint rustle. Mark stirred but dismissed it as the wind. The next noise was louder, a metallic clang like something heavy brushing against the bear canister. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear through the darkness. Outside, the bear was testing its surroundings, nudging the canister with its snout, frustrated by its unyielding surface. But the smell of humans, faint but distinct, drew it closer. Then came the unmistakable tear of the fabric. The tent wall ripped open, a sharp and surreal sound in the stillness. Emily bolted upright, clutching Ethan to her chest as Claire scrambled toward her parents. Mark saw the bear in the dim light of their lantern, a hulking shape looming at the gash it had made, its eyes catching the faint glow of the light. It wasn't fully grown, but still massive, its shoulders heaving with anticipation. The scent of sweat and fear filled the confined space. Mark instinctively grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the bear. He yelled and waved his arms, trying to make himself appear larger. The bear hesitated, startled by the sudden brightness and noise. But instead of retreating, it swatted at the tent, ripping another section open. The family scrambled toward the truck parked nearby. Emily clutched the children, urging them forward as Mark stood his ground, trying to distract the bear. Outside the tent, the chaos of the moment was magnified. The night, once serene, was now alive with movement and sound. Emily shoved the children into the truck's cab and climbed in after them, locking the doors. The bear turned toward the commotion, drawn to the vehicle. Mark grabbed a branch from the fire pit and lit its charred end, creating a makeshift torch. He waved it at the bear, hoping the flame and smoke would drive it away. But the bear didn't flee. It lunged instead, swiping at Mark with startling speed. The blow sent him sprawling, the torch flying from his hands and extinguishing in the dirt. Pain exploded through his chest as he scrambled backward, blood soaking his shirt. The bear loomed over him, its growls deep and guttural, a sound that reverberated through the air and into Emily's panicked breaths inside the truck. Mark fought with everything he had. He grabbed rocks, dirt, and anything within reach, hurling them at the bear's face. It reared back momentarily, but its aggression only grew. Each time he tried to crawl toward the truck, the bear blocked him, snapping its jaws and swiping with its claws. Emily pressed her hands inside the vehicle over Ethan and Claire's ears, trying to shield them from the horrifying scene unfolding just a few feet away. The truck shook slightly as the bear turned its attention to it, scratching at the windows and sniffing around the doors. Battered and bleeding, Mark took the momentary distraction to reach for the truck's back bumper. He pulled himself upright, gasping through the pain, and fumbled for his bear spray in the cargo bed. He unleashed the spray with trembling hands just as the bear turned back toward him. The chemical cloud hit its face, and the bear recoiled, coughing and shaking its head. It stumbled away from the truck, retreating several yards but not entirely leaving. Mark collapsed against the bumper, his body trembling, blood dripping onto the gravel. The bear paced at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible in the dim light. It let out a low, rumbling growl before disappearing into the tree line, leaving the campsite in silence once more. Emily rushed out of the truck, dragging Mark into the cab and pressing towels from their gear against his wounds. His breathing was ragged, his face pale, but he was alive. They spent the rest of the night huddled in the truck, too terrified to move or make a sound. Mark's injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. Deep gashes across his torso and arms, bruises blooming where the bear's massive paws had struck. Every passing hour felt like an eternity until the first light of dawn filtered through the forest canopy. At sunrise, Emily drove them to the nearest ranger station, Mark groaning softly with each bump in the road. Rangers called for medical assistance and took their report, their faces grim as they listened. This wasn't the first time they had heard of a bear behaving this way, and they feared it wouldn't be the last. In the weeks that followed, the family grappled with the aftermath. Mark survived his injuries but bore the scars, both physical and emotional, of that night. Ethan and Claire refused to sleep in a tent again, their dreams haunted by the sound of tearing fabric and their father's pained cries. Emily wrestled with guilt, replaying the events over and over, questioning whether they had done enough to prevent the attack. The bear, meanwhile, remained a specter in the forest. Rangers attempted to track it, but the vast wilderness offered plenty of hiding places. The Alaskan wilderness lay draped in a blanket of foreboding quiet that gnawed at a seasoned hunter's instincts. Liam Burke, driven by ambition and a relentless need to make his mark, trekked deeper into the remote backcountry, his rifle confidently over his shoulder. Every step of his journey was fueled by the belief that this was his moment, a chance to take down a bear of mythical proportions and etch his name into the annals of hunting lore. The rumors had drawn him here. Locals whispered of a monstrous grizzly, one whose claw marks reached impossibly high on the trees and whose roar could silence the wilderness. They spoke of it with awe and fear, but Liam saw only opportunity. He dismissed their warnings, chalking them up to superstition or embellishment. The thrill of pursuit, the promise of fame, and the unyielding determination to prove himself drowned out any caution. On the second day of tracking, signs of the bear grew increasingly unsettling. Fresh scat steamed in the morning air, claw marks gouged into bark suggested a size that defied belief, and the forest had grown unnervingly silent. Liam's gut churned, though he rationalized it as the usual tension of the hunt. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt like an intruder, but the obsession with finding the beast overrode the primal fear clawing at his chest. By the third day, he spotted it. The bear emerged from the shadowed woods like an apparition, a massive grizzly with a hulking frame that seemed too immense for the landscape. Its thick fur rippled as it moved, muscles coiled with terrifying power. Liam's pulse hammered as he raised his rifle, a lifetime of hunting experience distilling into a single, focused moment. The shot rang out, shattering the forest's silence. But the bullet didn't find its mark. The bear reared up, letting out a roar that shook Liam. Then, it disappeared into the trees, vanishing as swiftly as it had appeared. Liam thought he'd scared it off momentarily, but unease gripped him as he realized the forest felt wrong. The birds didn't return to their song, and no rustle of small animals followed the bear's retreat. The silence felt alive, as though the wilderness itself was watching him. The bear didn't flee. It hunted. Liam pressed on, determined to regain the upper hand. He followed its tracks, but the sense of control began slipping away. The bear seemed to anticipate his every move, doubling back and leading him in circles, forcing him deeper into terrain that grew more treacherous with every step. Twice he caught glimpses of it, eyes gleaming like twin embers in the distance, watching him from the shadows. It was toying with him. By nightfall, exhaustion weighed heavily on Liam. He set up camp, his fire burning low as he clutched his rifle, every sound in the darkness sharpening his frayed nerves. The bear didn't attack that night. Instead, it paced just beyond the firelight, snapping twigs and growling low in its throat, the vibrations traveling through the ground beneath him. Liam's hands trembled as he gripped his weapon, his confidence eroding with every passing hour. The second day of pursuit was worse. Liam's food supplies were dwindling and his water was almost gone. Fatigue blurred his thoughts and fear crept in where arrogance once stood. The bear's strategy became clear. It was wearing him down. No longer was he the predator. He was prey, running on borrowed time. When the attack came, it was sudden and brutal. Liam had stopped to catch his breath, his knees buckling as he leaned against a tree. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath. Then, the bear charged. It erupted from the underbrush like a freight train, its massive frame moving with a terrifying speed and precision. Liam barely had time to raise his rifle before the bear was on him, its enormous paw swiping the weapon from his hands and sending it into the dirt. The force of the blow sent him sprawling, pain exploding in his chest as he struggled to crawl away. The grizzly loomed over him, its breath hot and horrid as it bared its teeth. Liam's survival instincts kicked in, and he reached for his hunting knife, slashing wildly as the bear descended. The blade struck flesh, but it was a feeble attempt against the sheer mass and fury of the beast. The bear roared a guttural sound that echoed through the wilderness and mauled him relentlessly. Its claws tore into his flesh, shredding muscle and splintering bone. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the earth as his screams faded into gasping cries. It took time. The bear relished the kill, asserting its primal dominance with every swipe and bite. When it was done, the grizzly stood over the hunter's broken body, its fur matted with blood, breathing heavily. It lingered momentarily, as if acknowledging its victory, before disappearing into the shadows again. Days later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the remains. The scene was gruesome, the forest eerily silent as though mourning the violence that had taken place. Liam's body lay torn and mangled, his rifle snapped in two, and claw marks gouged deep into the surrounding trees. News of the attack spread quickly. Already a legend, the grizzly symbolized nature's untouchable ferocity. And Liam? His name achieved fame, but not as he had envisioned. He was remembered not as the great hunter who conquered the wilderness, but as a cautionary tale, a man whose hubris led him into a battle he was never prepared to fight. The crisp morning air in the Bighorn Mountains carried a bite, invigorating the ultra-marathoners as they pounded through the remote wilderness. The race was a grueling test of physical endurance and mental fortitude, a 100-mile loop through rocky trails, dense forests, and steep inclines. Sarah, a seasoned runner in her early 30s, had trained for months for this moment. Her strides were confident, her breathing steady as she led the pack, the rhythm of her steps syncing with the rustle of wind through the pines. By midday, the racers had spread out across the rugged terrain. Running solo in the lead, Sarah felt a heady mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her calves burned from the relentless climbs, and her shirt clung to her skin, damp with sweat. Yet she reveled in the isolation. Her element was the untamed wild, the challenge of conquering it with nothing but her body and willpower. The trail curved through a dense thicket, the foliage so thick it muffled the sound of her footfalls. A sudden rustle to her right snapped her attention. Her eyes caught a flash of movement. A bear cub, no bigger than a large dog, scurrying into view. The cub froze, its dark eyes locking onto hers. Sarah's heart skipped. She slowed her pace, instincts whispering caution, but her forward momentum carried her closer than she intended. She had no time to react before a thunderous roar erupted from the underbrush. The mother bear, enormous and bristling with fury, burst onto the trail in a blur of motion. Adrenaline surged through Sarah's veins. She veered off the path, sprinting into the woods without thought, her feet slipping on the loose earth. The bear pursued her with terrifying speed, its growls reverberating through the trees. Sarah's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, zigzagging through the forest, desperately attempting to outpace the predator. Branches whipped against her face and arms, leaving stinging welts. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the bear closing the gap, its bulk moving swiftly. Her foot snagged on a root, and she fell hard, the impact jarring her shoulder. Before she could scramble to her feet, the bear was upon her. Its massive paw swiped at her back, ripping through fabric and flesh. Pain exploded along her spine, but she rolled instinctively, narrowly avoiding the next strike. Blood soaked her shirt as she reached for the whistle around her neck, blowing it in short, shrill bursts. The sound pierced the air, a desperate cry for help. Further down the trail, the other runners heard the commotion. The sharp blasts of the whistle and the bear's roars jolted them into action. Among them was James, a former firefighter whose instincts to protect overrode his fear. He grabbed a trekking pole and motioned for others to follow, the small group hastily forming a plan as they raced toward the sounds of struggle. Sarah, meanwhile, fought to stay alive. She curled into a ball, protecting her head and neck as the bear continued its assault. Each blow felt like a sledgehammer, forcing the air from her lungs. In the chaos, she spotted her running vest, flung a few feet away, with the canister of bear spray attached. Summoning her remaining strength, she crawled toward it, her fingers brushing the strap as the bear lunged again. The sound of shouting broke through the haze of pain. The other runners had arrived, their voices loud and firm as they waved their arms, attempting to draw the bear's attention. James hurled a rock, striking the bear's flank. It turned, momentarily distracted, and Sarah seized the opportunity. She grabbed the bear spray and aimed, her trembling hands releasing a burst of orange mist into the animal's face. The bear roared in confusion, shaking its head violently. Blinded and overwhelmed, it backed away, retreating toward the cub that had caused the commotion. The runners stood frozen, watching it disappear into the forest, its growls fading into the distance. Sarah collapsed onto her side, her breath shallow and uneven. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the forest floor. James knelt beside her, his hands steady despite the urgency in his voice as he assessed her injuries. Her back was a mess of torn flesh and bruises, but none of the wounds appeared life-threatening. Another runner, Emily, dug through her pack, producing a first aid kit. Together, they cleaned and dressed Sarah's wounds, their hands working quickly despite the trembling that came with the adrenaline crash. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from tree branches and race bibs, knowing that waiting for professional help in a remote area wasn't an option. The group moved cautiously, progressing slowly as they navigated the uneven trail back toward the nearest aid station. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body racked with pain and exhaustion. She marveled at the sheer resilience of the human body and spirit in her lucid moments. The camaraderie of her fellow runners, strangers until this moment, was the only reason she was alive. Hours later, they reached the aid station, where race officials and medics took over. Sarah was airlifted to a hospital, her injuries severe but survivable. The remaining runners, shaken but unharmed, continued their journey, carrying the weight of the day's events. In the days that followed, Sarah replayed the encounter in her mind. She couldn't escape the image of the bear's eyes, wild and unrelenting, driven not by malice, but by an instinct to protect. It was a reminder of nature's raw power and the fragility of human life in its grasp. Though her recovery was long and arduous, Sarah eventually returned to the trails. Her scars, both physical and emotional, became a testament to her survival.